I often get more questions about the academic proposal assignment than I do about anything else in English 1301. And I don't think it's because the academic proposal is such a difficult assignment to complete. It is a little bit longer than some of the other assignments we've done. There are some things required that aren't required for other assignments, but I really don't think that's why the questions are so frequent. I think instead that the academic proposal is simply a kind of assignment that very few of you have any direct experience with. And as a result, it's often difficult for students to understand exactly what the assignment is asking for. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about academic proposals and talking about our assignment specifically, so you have a better understanding of what it is you need to do to be successful on this assignment. Now, this may seem a little strange to you, but I think that the best way to understand what an academic proposal is to do two things. First of all, to look at the name of the assignment, academic proposal, and try to figure out what's implied in each of those two terms. And at the same time, to compare the academic proposal to another assignment that we've done earlier this semester, the public argument. Because while there are some important similarities between a public argument and an academic proposal, I think it's the differences that will help us understand what an academic proposal is. First of all, let's look at the second part of the term. What is a proposal, and how is a proposal different from an argument? And really the answer is that a proposal isn't necessarily different from an argument. It's just a specific kind of argument. Most of you, not all of you, but most of you for your public arguments wrote what are essentially called position papers. In other words, you outlined your position at the beginning of the paper. You talked about what was positive about your position. In other words, gave your audience reasons to agree with you. You might have responded to some objections. In other words, said, here's why you shouldn't take the other side or disagree with me. And then you concluded by reiterating the importance of your position or the value of your position in general. Now, a proposal is a little more specific than that. A proposal, unlike a public argument, unlike a position paper, is not just interested in persuading an audience to agree with you. Rather, a proposal is interested in persuading an audience to do something, to take some kind of action. Proposals have a different structure than a position paper will have. Rather than simply outlining the benefits of your position, a proposal has to address a specific problem. That's really the first step in writing the academic proposal, is finding a problem. And by problem, I don't necessarily mean something that's wrong in the literal sense, but rather something that needs to be improved in some way. Now, as a result of this, a proposal actually has to do sort of twice what a position paper has to do. A position paper simply has to justify your position. In other words, here's why I think this is right. Here's why I agree with this. Here's why you should agree with it. But a proposal is justifying two different things. It's justifying the problem and justifying a specific solution to the problem. So when you're writing a proposal, you have to convince your audience, first of all, that the problem exists, that the problem is serious, in other words, that it needs to be solved, and that the problem is somehow relevant to them. In other words, you have to be able to find some reason for your audience to care specifically about this problem. That last point, by the way, is going to be very important in a few minutes when we talk about the other part of this assignment. But an academic proposal also has to justify the solution to the problem. In other words, once you've convinced the audience that the problem exists and needs to be solved, you then have to convince the audience that your specific solution to the problem is the best solution, or is that it's superior to other solutions to the problem. So you have to justify the problem on the one hand, but justify the solution on the other hand. So the structure of a proposal will often differ from the structure of a position paper, whereas a position paper will identify the issue, find a position, argue for the position, respond to objections. An academic proposal, or actually any kind of proposal, will begin by identifying the problem, justifying the problem, identifying the solution, and then justifying the solution. Now, in my experience, this does not give students that much difficulty. Most students can see the difference in structure and approach between a paper that simply says, here's what I believe, I think you should agree with me, and a paper that says, here's a specific problem and here's how I think we should solve it, or what we should do that will make this problem better in some way. In fact, some of you may have written what were essentially proposals for your public argument. And that's fine, by the way. There's nothing wrong with writing a proposal for a public argument. But in other words, you may have identified some kind of problem and argued to your public audience that that problem needed to be solved in a particular way. And so in that case, the structure of the assignment may be more or less the same between the public argument and the academic proposal. Although in my experience, most students do not. Most students write papers that have this other position paper kind of structure more frequently than they do proposals. It's the other half of the name of the assignment that's going to give us some difficulties that we really need to think about. Because the academic proposal is different from the public argument, not just because it's a proposal rather than a position paper, but also because it's an academic paper rather than a public paper. Now, we need to figure out what this means. We've talked about academic writing, but it's important to remember that the reason we call academic writing is it's essentially writing inside a specific discourse community. Remember, we talked about discourse communities in the public argument assignment, that whenever we write an argument, we're writing to a specific audience that we're a part of and trying to approach that particular audience's values and assumptions. In other words, finding reasons that will convince not just a general audience, but the particular audience you've chosen. Well, academic writing is much the same. The only difference is that the audience is more or less set. In other words, it's other members of the academic community, scholars, professors, students, etc. All of the things we learned about academic style in the last unit, all of those features of academic writing, the fact that it's more formal, the fact that it's more impersonal, the fact that it's more thorough and more careful, etc., all of those things have to do with the audience and what the audience expects. An academic audience will expect a certain kind of writing. Another audience would expect something very different. So in addition to the difference between proposal and position paper, you now have to be concerned with the difference between an academic audience and a more public audience, an audience of a discourse community that you've chosen, which might be your peer group or your town or the people at your workplace or general American taxpayers or whatever discourse community you chose for the public argument. The academic proposal will be written to an academic audience. Now, what's that going to mean specifically? We actually already know one thing that it's going to mean, which is that the style of the paper is going to be different. We've talked about academic style. You've had a little bit of practice in making things more formal, less personal, etc. And so this paper will need to be written in academic style. But there are actually some bigger differences that have to do with the academic audience. First of all, we have to think of the kinds of topics that academic audiences will find relevant to them. And I said that one of the things you have to do in a proposal is demonstrate that the problem is relevant to the audience you're writing to. Well, an academic audience, we really don't know much about an academic audience. We don't know where the people in that audience live. We don't know how old they are. We don't know what their income level is or their personal interests or what gender they are or what ethnicity they are. We don't know anything about them. In fact, it's the lack of specificity that makes academic writing the way it is often. The reason you have to write formally is that you don't know your audience well enough to write informally. You can't use slang because slang is specific to age group or to regionality or something like that. So you can't use that in academic writing because you don't know the age group or the regionality of your audience. The academic audience could be people living anywhere in the world, people of any age. I mean, they have to be adults basically, but they could be people about your own age. They could be people much older than you. And we don't know anything about their personal interests. So you can't assume that the academic audience is interested in the particular workplace issue that you identified, or a particular issue in a hobby, or maybe you wrote about a TV show or something like that. We can't make those kinds of assumptions about an academic audience. They may not watch television. They may not have the same kinds of jobs that you have. So finding a topic that is appropriate to an academic audience is actually something of a challenge. Now, most topics it's possible to write about academically, but you have to change your sort of mindset and your relationship to the topic. So, for example, local topics. Maybe you wrote your public argument about the problem of traffic in Weatherford. And for people in Weatherford, that's obviously a real issue. But for an academic audience, well, that academic audience doesn't live in Weatherford. At least we don't know where they live. So as a result, they're not particularly going to care whether there's traffic in Weatherford or not. It's not going to be relevant to them. But that doesn't mean you can't write about that problem. It simply means you have to write about it in a different way. Rather than, in this case, rather than writing about the problems of traffic in Weatherford, you might write about the problems of traffic in fast-growing small towns across America, something like that. The academic audience may not live in a small town, but academic audiences are interested in ideas. And so often what you have to do is take a step back from the specific issue that you've written about for your public argument and find a way to write about an issue that's much more about ideas, about generalities. So if there's I had a student, for example, who wrote about, I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier lectures, who wrote about the need for direct deposit of paychecks at the restaurant where she worked. And it was actually a very successful public argument. That student had a real hard time making that into an academic proposal. What she ended up doing was writing about sort of the benefits that small businesses offer their employees. So she had a problem of high employee turnover in small businesses, and she wrote about the different kinds of benefits that could be offered to those employees that would make them more likely to stay employed. And in that way, she was able to take an issue that was really a local issue, really about the restaurant where she worked, and make it about ideas, the idea of benefits offered to workers in general. So the topic that you choose, you're going to have to write about a topic that is relevant to an academic community specifically. You can't write about a local issue. You can't write about a specific issue at your workplace. You can use those issues to get you into general ideas if you want, but you can't write about purely local issues to an academic audience. The other thing that's important about academic audiences is the way they are convinced. And we've talked about the different kinds of argument that you can use. We talked about ethos, pathos, and logos a little bit, the idea of arguing from authority or arguing from emotion or arguing from logic and fact and statistic. And in public arguments, you can use some combination of those different elements. You can use some emotional arguments if you use them with discretion. You can use those in public arguments. In an academic argument, you really can't use pathos-based or emotion-based appeals. And you can't use personal authority as an appeal either. You can't say, because I live in this town, I know about this. That's not going to convince an academic audience. An academic audience is convinced primarily by two things. First of all, by factual information, in other words, good, hard, logos-based arguments. And then by authority, but not personal authority. Rather, they're convinced by source authority. In other words, if you can demonstrate that credible sources agree with your proposal, or you can use those sources to somehow legitimize your ideas, that will make your argument more convincing to an academic audience. So to recap, the differences between academic arguments, and proposal, again, is a kind of an argument, and public arguments are three things. The style of the writing, you need to write in an academic style. The kinds of topics, you need to find a topic that is relevant and of interest to an academic audience, which means usually that you need to write about more general idea-based topics. And then the kinds of appeals that you use to convince the audience. And specifically in this case, what we're talking about is using source material, which is why there's a requirement of a little research for the academic proposal. If you can find good information in credible sources, your argument is going to be much more convincing to an academic audience than it would if you don't use those kinds of sources. Now, I'll discuss what makes a source credible in later materials on the course page, as well as the issue of documentation, which is very important for an academic audience. An academic audience will expect a very high level of clear and formal documentation of all source material. But these are the general principles that you need to be thinking about right now. You need to be thinking about a topic that an academic audience would respond to or be interested in. You need to think about the kinds of evidence, the kinds of appeals, the kinds of sources that you'd want to use to help convince your audience. And then you'd want to think about the style and tone of your paper. You may want to review the materials on academic style and tone that were discussed in Unit 3 of the course. For now, though, start thinking about a topic for your proposal. If you have any questions about the assignment, don't hesitate to ask me. Thank you.